Abigail Harper threw her only bag into the dirt and stood in the middle of that Kansas street with tears she refused to let fall because she'd promised herself on that long, miserable coach ride across 3 states that she would not cry in front of strangers. She had done everything right, sold her mother's china, paid for her own passage, answered a man's advertisement honestly, completely, without hiding a single thing about who she was. And Thomas Reed had looked her up and down in front of 40 people and said, clear as Sunday morning, "That ain't what I sent for." That's the moment this story begins. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, not pretty enough, not small enough, not what somebody expected, I want you to stay with me through every single part of this story. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you don't miss a single chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And I promise you, what happens to Abigail Harper is going to remind you of something you've always known deep down, but maybe needed to hear again. Now let's go back to that Kansas street. Let's go back to the moment everything fell apart so you can watch it become something nobody in that town ever expected. The stagecoach from Dodge City pulled into Harlan Creek just past noon on a Tuesday in July of 1886, and the heat was the kind that made the air itself feel dishonest, shimmering, and bent promising shade that wasn't there. Abigail Harper was the last passenger to step down. She was 32 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and had spent the better part of her adult life being made to feel like an apology. She wore a blue traveling dress she'd sewn herself, let out twice across the bodice, because the seamstress in St. Louis had looked at her with thinly veiled pity when she'd asked for help. Her dark hair was pinned neat beneath a bonnet that had survived 3 days of dust and rocking, and the particular indignity of a man across the coach who'd asked loud enough for everyone to hear whether the driver had been told there'd be extra weight on this run. She had not answered him. She had looked out the window at the passing prairie and breathed through her nose and told herself what she'd been telling herself for the last 6 months, ever since she'd first read the advertisement in the St. Louis Courier-Democrat, folded small and tucked into her coat pocket, until the paper had gone soft along the creases. Widowed rancher Western Kansas seeks companionable wife for partnership and honest living. Children in household. Comfort of home guaranteed. Character valued above all. Character valued above all. She had read those 4 words so many times they'd become a kind of prayer. Thomas Reed had written back to her letter within 2 weeks. His reply was plain-spoken and decent. He said he was 44, that he had 2 sons aged 9 and 11, that the ranch was modest but solvent, and that he was looking for a woman with good sense and a willing spirit. He said nothing about what she looked like. She had told him in her letter, not in detail but plainly, that she was a larger woman, that she'd never been what men called handsome, but that she was hardworking and capable, and had managed her father's household accounts for 11 years without a single error. He had written back again. He said that sounded fine. She had taken that to mean something. She had taken that to mean everything. So she had sold her mother's china, her father's pocket watch, the small writing desk she'd loved since she was a girl. She'd paid off the last of her rent, said goodbye to the 2 friends she had left in St. Louis, and climbed into a westbound coach with $43 one bag and a heart so full of stubborn hope it embarrassed her when she thought about it too directly. Now she stepped off that coach into the blinding Kansas noon, and she felt the town look at her before she could get her bearings. Not everyone was watching. Most people had their own business. But enough people were idling near the stage stop. A knot of men outside the general store. 2 women on the boardwalk, a boy perched on a hitching post that Abigail felt the particular weight of collective attention settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. She lifted her chin. She picked up her bag. She looked for Thomas Reed. He wasn't hard to find. He'd described himself in his letters. Tall, dark-haired, going to gray at the temples, tended to wear a brown hat. He was standing about 20 feet away, arms loose at his sides, watching the coach, watching her step off it. She saw his face change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the exaggerated grimace of a man performing disgust for an audience. It was subtler, And worse than that, a kind of flattening, a withdrawal, the expression of a man who has just realized he has made a mistake and is calculating how to manage the inconvenience of it. He walked toward her anyway. She gave him credit for that. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Reed." She put out her hand. He shook it briefly, barely. "I'm glad to finally meet you in person. I had a fine journey mostly." He didn't say anything to that. He looked at her face, at her figure, at the traveling dress she'd sewn herself, and something in his expression went from calculation to conclusion. "You didn't mention," he said. She knew what he meant. Her stomach tightened. "I told you I was a larger woman," she said, keeping her voice even. "In my second letter, I was direct about it. I figured that meant—" He stopped, shook his head once. "It doesn't matter what I figured." "Mr. Reed." "I'm sorry you came all this way," he said. And then louder, not because the situation called for volume, but because some men expand when they're uncomfortable, fill more space than they need, as if size in that moment might substitute for decency. "You're not what I expected. I can't marry a woman who's not what I expected." The knot of men outside the general store heard it. One of them laughed. Not meanly exactly, more the reflexive laugh of someone who doesn't know what else to do, but it rippled outward and found friends, and within 10 seconds there were other sounds that weren't laughter but were adjacent to it. Murmurs and exchanges, and a woman on the boardwalk leaning toward her companion with something cupped in her hand that she was putting into the other woman's ear. Abigail stood in the middle of the street. She did not cry. She had promised herself. She kept her eyes on Thomas Reed, and she said quietly, "I came here in good faith, Mr. Reed. You have my correspondence. You know that." "I'm sorry," he said again, and had the grace to look briefly ashamed, and then walked away. Just walked away. She watched him go. The sun pressed down on the top of her bonnet like a hand. Her bag was heavy in her grip. She had $43. She did not know a single person in this town. The next stage east didn't run until Thursday, which was 2 days from now, and she didn't know what a hotel room cost in a town like Harlan Creek. But she suspected $43 might not survive the wait and the return fare both. She became aware in the specific and terrible way of someone who has just been publicly humiliated of exactly how many eyes were still on her. She stood very still because movement felt impossible, and because she was beneath everything a woman who had survived harder mornings than this one, even if she couldn't quite locate that knowledge at the moment. "Ma'am?" The voice came from behind her, and to the left, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to work to carry itself. She turned. He was leaning against the corner post of the land office, arms folded, hat pushed back slightly on his head, in the way of a man who's been standing there a while and hasn't felt the need to announce it. He wasn't watching her the way the others had been. He was watching Thomas Reed's retreating back, with an expression that was hard to read, not anger exactly, not pity exactly, somewhere in the territory between contempt and sorrow. Then he looked at her. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a little older. Sun-darkened face. A rancher's build, not bulked up for show, but the kind of lean, deliberate strength that comes from 15 years of genuine labor. His eyes were a steady gray-green that reminded her incongruously of the Missouri River in October. He pushed off the post and walked toward her. Not fast. Not with the energy of someone trying to be a hero. Just directly. As if he'd made a decision several minutes ago and was only now getting around to acting on it. He stopped a respectful distance from her and tipped his hat one clean motion. "Ma'am, my name is Ethan Walker. I've got a ranch about 4 miles northeast of town." He paused. "I heard what that man said to you." "I expect most of the street heard it," Abigail said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd anticipated. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't apologize on behalf of the town, or explain, or editorialize. He just acknowledged it as fact. "I've got a spare room, clean, private. My housekeeper, Mrs. Dolan, sleeps on the premises, so the arrangement would be proper." Another pause, shorter. "I'm not offering you charity. I could use help with the ranch accounts, and I've got no wife to manage the household. If you're willing to work for your keep until you figure out what's next, I'd consider it a fair trade." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She was not naive. She was 32 years old, and had been navigating men's intentions for 20 of those years, and she had developed out of necessity a reasonably accurate instrument for detecting the difference between genuine plainness and dressed-up predation. What she saw in Ethan Walker was plainness, uncomplicated matter-of-fact decency. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because what just happened to you was wrong," he said, "and standing here watching it didn't sit right with me." She almost said something then, some form of gratitude or deflection, but what came out instead was the thing she actually meant. "If I come with you and it turns out you're not what you seem to be, then you leave," he said simply. "Mrs. Dolan'll drive you back to town herself if it comes to that. You have my word." She picked up her bag. "All right, Mr. Walker," she said. "I'll come." He nodded, picked up her bag before she could protest, not with any show of chivalry, just practically the way a person picks up something heavy when they're standing right next to it. She followed him to his wagon without looking back at the street. But she felt it behind her, the looks, the whispers, the particular quality of a small town reassembling its narrative around an unexpected development, and she filed it away in the part of herself that had learned over years of being underestimated to pay attention to who was watching and why. The ride out to the Walker Ranch took the better part of an hour because one of the traces needed tending, and Ethan drove with the easy patience of a man who didn't try to fight a road. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary talk. Abigail appreciated that more than she could have said. After about 20 minutes, she said, "You mentioned ranch accounts." "Yes, ma'am." "What kind of records do you keep?" He glanced at her sideways. "Ledger book, monthly. I do it myself, but I'm not—" He paused, and she got the impression he was choosing honesty over self-preservation. "I'm not good with the detail of it. I miss things. Last spring, I had a discrepancy of nearly $60 that took me 3 weeks to find." "What was it?" "Feed supplier double-charged me for a November delivery, and I didn't catch it until March." Abigail said, "Do you still have his invoices?" "I have all my invoices, everyone going back 6 years." "Then he owes you that money." Ethan Walker looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. "That's what my brother said. I told him I didn't have time to pursue it." "With proper documentation," Abigail said, "you could settle it in a single letter." He was quiet for a moment. Then, That was the first conversation they had. She would remember it later as the moment she understood that this man's silence was not dismissal. It was attention. He was a man who listened with his full self and then thought about what he'd heard before he responded, and that in her experience, which had not been gentle on the subject of men, was rarer than silver. The ranch announced itself first through the sound of cattle, low and distant, before the buildings came into view. When they did, she took in the state of it. Without comment, the house needed paint. The near fence had a gap she could see from here, and there was a general sense of a place that had been managed rather than tended. Not neglect exactly, but the particular quality of a household where someone was doing their best and not quite reaching it. A heavy-set woman of about 60 came out of the house before the wagon had fully stopped. Iron gray hair apron, the expression of someone who has seen enough of life to be interested rather than surprised by most things. "This is Mrs. Dolan," Ethan said. "She'll get you settled." Mrs. Dolan looked at Abigail with frank, unhurried appraisal and then said, "You hungry? I've got cold chicken and cornbread from this morning." "I am," Abigail said. "Thank you." "Good." Mrs. Dolan took her bag with the same practical ease Ethan had. "Come in then. Don't let the screen door, a bang, hit you." The room was clean and simple, and had a window that looked east over the prairie. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 90 seconds, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day. The humiliation, the fear, the strange grace of Ethan Walker's plain-spoken offer. And then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to find the kitchen. She was going to earn her keep. That was not charity. That was contract. She began that same afternoon. The household accounts were in worse shape than the fence, which was saying something. Abigail spread the ledger book across the kitchen table after supper, when Mrs. Dolan had gone to her room, and Ethan had come in from the evening chores smelling of horses and dust, and she began going through it page by page, making small marks in the margins with a pencil she'd asked Mrs. Dolan for. Ethan sat across from her with a cup of coffee and watched without interrupting. After about an hour, she said, "Your feed costs are running about 18% higher than they should for the size of your herd." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know what they should be running?" "My father ran a dry goods business for 30 years. I did his accounts from the time I was 14. I know what things cost, and I know what the margin between what things cost and what you're being charged ought to look like." She looked up. "Your supplier in Dodge Hartwell and Sons, they've been adjusting their prices without adjusting their invoices. It's subtle, a few cents here, a few cents there, but over 2 years it adds up to—" She ran a quick calculation in her head. "Somewhere between $90 and $120. The silence that followed was longer than the other silences. "That's a significant sum," Ethan said finally. "It's theft," Abigail said plainly. "Soft theft, the kind that's hard to prove and easy to deny, but theft. Can you prove it?" "With the invoices, yes. It'll take me a few days to document it properly, but yes." She paused. "That's if you want me to." He looked at her across the table with that gray-green, steady regard, and she had the odd sensation, unsettling and not unpleasant, of being seen without being evaluated. As if his eyes were doing something different than most eyes did when they looked at her. "I want you to," he said. She nodded and went back to the ledger. She stayed up past midnight that first night, not because anyone asked her to, but because the problem was interesting and the solution was close, and she had never in her life been able to leave a problem unsolved when the solution was close. What she did not know and would not know for some time was that Ethan Walker sat at that table with his cold coffee for another hour after she'd taken the ledger to her room, thinking about a woman who had been handed a devastating humiliation and had within 4 hours of arriving diagnosed a $100 fraud and started building the case to correct it. He had known a great many people in his life. He had never met anyone quite like her. The first week passed in work. Abigail established herself in the household with the efficiency of someone who has never had the luxury of inefficiency. She reorganized the pantry, not because she'd been asked, but because the current organization was costing Mrs. Dolan 20 extra minutes of effort every day. She identified 3 places in the supply ordering system where Ethan was paying for redundant delivery fees. She wrote the letter to Hartwell and Sons, precise, documented, unarguable, and Ethan read it through twice before signing it, and nodding once in a way that felt she was learning like high praise. She tended the kitchen garden in the morning when the air was still cool and the work was its own reward. She mended what needed mending. She cooked, though Mrs. Dolan remained in nominal charge of the kitchen. They had arrived without discussion at a companionable division of labor that suited them both. And she observed that Ethan's 2 sons, Marcus 11 and James 9, circled her with the careful wariness of children who had learned that new people in their household sometimes didn't stay. Marcus, the older one, was all sharp edges and protective bluster. He watched her from doorways and answered her questions in clipped syllables and didn't touch his plate if she'd been the one to set it down. James was different. James was curious in the way of a child who has not yet decided whether curiosity is safe, which meant he hovered and retreated in a pattern that would have been almost comical if it hadn't been so plainly genuine. On the 3rd day, she left a piece of cornbread on the kitchen windowsill with a small paper twist of cinnamon sugar on top of it, because she'd noticed James eyeing the sugar jar. She didn't make a production of it, she just left it there. It was gone 20 minutes later. That evening, James asked her if she knew how to play checkers. "I do," she said. "Papa taught us," he said, "but he always wins." "That's because your papa lets you see his strategy too early," Abigail said. "You keep watching his hands, not the board." James stared at her. "How did you know?" "Because it's the natural thing to do and it's wrong. You want to play?" They played 3 games at the kitchen table, while Ethan watched from the doorway without announcing himself. James won the second game, which made him so shocked he forgot to celebrate for a moment. Abigail heard a sound from the doorway that she thought might have been a laugh quietly converted into a cough. She did not look up, but she filed it away. It was at the end of the second week that she had her first real conversation with Marcus. He found her in the kitchen garden at 6 in the morning on her knees in the dirt, with her sleeves pushed up, clearing a stand of bindweed from the tomato row. She heard him behind her and kept working, because she had learned early that Marcus approached things sideways and didn't respond well to being directly addressed. He stood there for a while. Then, "You're pulling it wrong." Pulling. She sat back on her heels and looked over her shoulder. He was standing with his arms crossed, the particular posture of a boy performing indifference. "Am I? If you just pull the vine, it breaks off, and the root stays, and it comes back worse. You gotta get the root." "Show me." He blinked. He hadn't expected that. He stayed still for another beat, then came forward and crouched beside her, and worked his fingers into the soil at the base of the vine, excavating carefully, following the root system down, until he could get his hand under the whole thing, and then he pulled a slow, steady resistance, and it came out whole. "See?" He held it up. "That's a good technique," Abigail said, and she meant it. "Where'd you learn that?" "Mama," he said, and the word came out unguarded, and then he seemed to realize what he'd said, and his expression did something complicated. She didn't push. She turned back to her own section of the garden. She had a good garden. A pause. "Yes, ma'am." A longer pause. She said the garden was the part of the ranch that was hers. Papa built everything, but the garden was hers. "That makes sense," Abigail said. "A person needs something that's theirs." She kept working. So after a moment did Marcus. They weeded in silence for the better part of an hour, and when Mrs. Dolan called them in for breakfast, Marcus held the gate open for her without being asked. She did not make anything of it, but she filed it away. It was in the third week that the letter arrived from the Hartwell and Sons Company. Ethan read it at the breakfast table. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted in the set of his jaw. "They're denying it," he said. "I expected that," Abigail said. "May I see?" He passed it across. She read it. The language was evasive in the specific way of men who know they've been caught and are testing whether the person who caught them has what it takes to follow through. "They're hoping you'll drop it," she said. "I figured." "You won't." He looked at her. "No, I won't." "Good. Then you'll need to file a formal complaint with the Dodge City Merchants Board. I'll draft it today. I'll need you to sign it, and we'll need copies of every invoice going back to January of '84. "I have them." "Then we'll be fine." He kept looking at her for a moment. "You've done this kind of thing before." "My father had a supplier problem in 1879, she said. "Not the same situation, but similar mechanics. The solution was documentation. It usually is. And you solved it." "My father solved it. I helped him build the case." "How old were you?" 25. Ethan Walker said nothing for a moment. Then, "He must have been grateful to have you." It was the simplest kind of statement. Plain as the table between them. But something in it, the matter-of-fact quality of it, the ease with which he said must have been grateful to have you, as if it were obvious, as if a man being grateful to have her around, were the only natural conclusion, struck her somewhere tender and unexpected. "He was," she said carefully. "He was a good man." "When did he pass?" 3 years ago. He left me the house, but the debts were—" She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. "It was a difficult time. And you ended up answering an advertisement in a newspaper," Ethan said, not unkindly, but plainly. "Yes." He nodded. "I'm sorry the man who placed it was a fool." She felt the corner of her mouth do something it hadn't done in several days. "So am I." He picked up his coffee. She went back to the Hartwell correspondence. And the kitchen was warm and ordinary, and full of the sounds of Mrs. Dolan moving efficiently between the stove and the counter, and James arguing from the next room that he was too absolutely sure he'd washed his hands, and Abigail thought with a kind of bewildered gratitude she didn't entirely trust. This is what a home sounds like. She was careful with that thought. She'd been wrong about safety before, but she tucked it away gently, in the same place she kept all the things she was still deciding whether to believe. And outside, the Kansas summer pressed on, golden and enormous and indifferent. While inside the Walker Ranch, something was beginning that neither of the two people most responsible for it had yet found words to name. The Merchants Board in Dodge City ruled in Ethan's favor 6 weeks later. Hartwell and Sons was ordered to remit the overcharge with 10% interest. The figure came out to $107. Word traveled as it does in small places, and it traveled with a particular quality of surprise, not because justice had been done, but because a woman had come to a stranger's house and done it quietly and without fanfare, in between weeding the garden and teaching the younger boy to play checkers. People in Harlan Creek began to talk about the Walker Ranch in the same tone they used for things that had turned around when no one was quite looking. The fences were getting fixed. The accounts were sound. The house had flowers in the front window for the first time in years. Ethan Walker, who had always been well regarded but quietly assumed to be in a slow decline, the way of a widower managing alone, was suddenly a man whose operation people were watching with respect. And the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach to be rejected in the public street and gone home with a stranger instead was the quiet fact at the center of all of it. Abigail was aware of this. She was also aware, with the careful, watchful attention she'd been exercising since that first night with the ledger, that something was changing between her and Ethan Walker that had nothing to do with balance sheets and fence repairs. He had begun finding reasons to be near the house in the evenings, not intrusively, not with any performance of intention. He was a man who was, she suspected, only dimly aware himself of the pattern he was following. But where he had previously been in the barn or the far pasture until dark and then come in for supper and retired almost immediately, he now came in while the light was still good and found things to do in the kitchen doorway or at the yard table where she sometimes sat to do the accounts. He would have a cup of coffee and say something about the cattle or the weather or a report he'd heard from a neighboring ranch, and she would respond, and they would talk for 20 minutes or an hour in the easy, particular way of two people who have discovered, somewhat to their surprise, that they speak the same language. He never said anything that crossed a line, neither did she, but she felt the pull of it, the thing building between them, wordless and patient, and it frightened her in a way that was also underneath the fear. Something she didn't have a better name for than hope. She was frightened of hope. She had brought hope with her on the stagecoach from St. Louis, and hope had been standing right there when Thomas Reed looked at her and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. She did not know what to do with a hope that kept coming back anyway. What she did not know, yet what she was still several weeks and a great deal of pain away from understanding, was that Ethan Walker was frightened too. That he had been frightened since about the 4th day when he'd walked past the kitchen door and seen her laughing at something James had said. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and felt something shift in the still careful interior he'd been maintaining since his wife died. He had been careful about himself for 3 years. He did not entirely know how to be careless, but the woman who'd arrived on a Tuesday in July, humiliated and penniless and still somehow unbroken, was making it increasingly difficult to remain careful. And neither of them, on that late summer evening with the prairie going gold outside the window, and the boys doing their sums at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Dolan humming something tuneless from the next room, could have predicted what was coming. Could have predicted that the thing that would force everything into the open was not softness, but crisis, not a quiet evening, but a cold morning, not a confession, but a return. Thomas Reed had heard about the Hartwell ruling. He had heard about the Walker Ranch, and he was thinking in the particular recalculating way of men who only understand value when someone else has demonstrated it, that perhaps he had been hasty. Thomas Reed had heard about the Hartwell ruling. He had heard about the Walker Ranch, and he was thinking in the particular recalculating way of men who only understand value when someone else has demonstrated it, that perhaps he had been hasty. Abigail didn't know that yet. She was still inside the ordinary rhythm of late summer days on the Walker Ranch, the early mornings in the garden, the long afternoons at the account books, the evenings that had begun almost without her noticing to feel like something she wanted rather than something she was tolerating. She noticed the change in Ethan before she had words for it. It started the evening Mrs. Dolan burned the roast. Not badly, it was salvageable, just dry at the edges and a little bitter, but Mrs. Dolan was mortified in the quiet way of a competent woman who has made a rare mistake in front of witnesses, and she retreated from the kitchen table the moment supper was over with more haste than usual. James ate his portion without complaint. Marcus pushed his around the plate until Abigail caught his eye and gave him the small level look she'd developed for moments when the boy needed to be steadied without being spoken to directly. He ate it. Ethan ate everything on his plate without comment, which was the exact right thing to do, and Abigail filed that away in the growing internal record she kept of the moments that told her who he was. After the boys went to bed, she was at the table with the week's accounts when Ethan came back in from checking the horses and stopped in the doorway. He'd been doing that lately, pausing in doorways as if he needed a moment to decide whether he was coming in or staying out. He came in, poured himself coffee, sat down across from her, which was also something he'd been doing more. "James told me you've been teaching him to read the stars," he said. "He asked me about them one evening," she said without looking up. "He'd gotten the dippers confused. He's got it now. He showed Marcus last night, and Marcus pretended not to be interested for about 3 minutes before he started asking questions." She looked up at that. "Did he?" "He did." Ethan wrapped both hands around his mug. "You've been good for them." The statement sat between them simple and unadorned, and Abigail felt it settle somewhere in her chest with more weight than it should have. "They've been good for me," she said. Ethan looked at her over his coffee. "You were lonely," he said. Not a question. "Most of my life," she said, and surprised herself with the plainness of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Me too." He said it the way a man says a thing he's been carrying around long enough that the edges have worn smooth. No drama in it. Just the fact. She went back to the accounts. He stayed at the table. The lamp burned between them, and the night pressed against the windows, and neither of them said anything else, and it was one of the more honest hours Abigail had spent in recent memory. That was a Thursday. On Saturday, Harlan Creek held its monthly market day in the square, and Ethan loaded the wagon with supplies Mrs. Dolan needed and told the boys they could come if they finished their chores before 9. He said it to Abigail without quite looking at her. "You're welcome to come if you want to see the town." She understood the subtext. The town had seen her arrive humiliated. He was offering her a chance to be seen differently. "All right," she said. It was Marcus who complicated things, which should not have surprised her, because Marcus always complicated things. He sat beside her in the wagon on the way, in which was itself unexpected. He'd been sitting in the back with James since her first day on the ranch, and about a mile outside of town, he said abruptly, "People are going to look at you." "People look at me most places," Abigail said. "Because you're—" He stopped. He was 11, and navigating language with the care of someone crossing unfamiliar ground. "Because of what happened. When you got here." "I know." "Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly, because Marcus was a boy who could tell when adults weren't being honest, and it made him angrier than almost anything else. "It used to bother me a great deal," she said. "What people thought of how I looked. It took up—" She paused. "It took up more of my time than I would have liked. And now I find it takes up less. I think—" She thought about how to say it. "I think what happens to your opinion of yourself when you find something you're genuinely good at and people see it is that you spend less time worrying about what they make of the rest of you." Marcus was quiet, processing. Then, like how Papa doesn't care that the Hendersons think his cattle are inferior because he knows his cattle and they don't. Exactly like that. He nodded, said nothing else. But when they pulled into the market square, and a woman near the dry goods store leaned toward her companion and cut a quick look at Abigail, Marcus straightened up beside her with the particular posture of a boy who has decided he is escorting someone and the town should know it. She did not make anything of it. She felt everything of it. The morning went smoothly. People were curious. She could feel that, but Ethan moved through the market with the ease of a man who belonged here, stopping to talk to neighbors, introducing her simply as Miss Harper, who's been helping run the ranch. And the lack of apology or explanation in his tone did more for her than any speech could have. A man named Cal Briggs, who ran the feed store, told Ethan he'd heard about the Hartwell business, and said pointedly that it was good to see the ranch doing well. His eyes went to Abigail when he said it. She inclined her head just slightly. James bought Whorehound candy with the 2 pennies he'd been saving, and immediately gave half to Marcus, which was a gesture so casually generous it made something in her chest ache. They were heading back to the wagon past the stage stop when she saw him. Thomas Reed was standing outside the hotel. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and she watched the particular sequence of expressions cross his face, recognition, something like discomfort, and then something calculating that made her stomach tighten. He walked toward her. Ethan was at the wagon, his back to the street, helping load a crate. The boys were beside her. She could have angled away. She didn't. "Miss Harper," Thomas said. He pulled his hat off, which was more courtesy than he'd shown her on the day they'd met. "I was hoping I might see you in town." "Mr. Reed?" she said. Her voice was level. "You're looking well." He paused. "I've been hearing things about the Walker Ranch. Good things." "The ranch is doing well?" "I heard about the Hartwell business." He turned his hat in his hands. "That took real ability." "It took documentation," Abigail said, "which takes time, which takes organization. Mr. Walker had the records. I read them carefully." "Still." Thomas looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the look of a man who has revised his estimate of something and wants credit for having revised it. "I wanted to say that I perhaps reacted too quickly when you arrived." Marcus, standing at her elbow, went very still. Abigail looked at Thomas Reed for a long moment. She thought about what she had felt standing on that street in the July sun, with her bag in her hand, and the sound of laughter moving through the crowd. She thought about the $43 and the eastbound stage that ran on Thursdays. She thought about what it had cost her to come here and what it had cost her to stay. "You said I wasn't what you expected," she said. "I believe that was accurate. I don't imagine either of us got what we expected." Thomas shifted. "I was wondering," he said, "whether you might consider whether we might have supper and talk about—" "No," she said. "Simple. Complete. No hedging or softening." Thomas looked briefly startled, which suggested he'd expected at least negotiation. "I appreciate that you came to say this," Abigail said, and she meant it because she was not a cruel person. "But I am employed and I am settled, and I don't believe supper would serve either of us." She inclined her head, the same small gesture she'd given Cal Briggs. Then she walked to the wagon where Ethan had turned around and was watching the street with an expression she couldn't entirely read. He helped her up without a word. Marcus climbed in the back with the efficiency of a boy who has stored something important to think about later. James was already in the back with his Whorehound candy, oblivious. They were out of town and onto the road home before Ethan said, "That was Thomas Reed." "Yes." Another pause. "What did he want?" "To apologize," she said. And then, after the apology, to have supper. She felt the shift in Ethan beside her, a tightening quick and controlled, and then he said carefully, "What did you tell him?" "I told him no." The road ran beneath them. The afternoon was cooling toward evening. Ethan drove with his eyes on the track ahead, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. "Why?" he said. And then, before she could answer, he seemed to realize how the question sounded, because he added, "You don't owe me an explanation. I wasn't—" "I know I don't owe you one," Abigail said. "I'll give you one anyway." She looked at the road rather than at him. "Because he saw what I could do and changed his mind. And a man who changes his mind about a woman the moment she becomes useful, that's not a man who sees her. That's a man who's revised his inventory." Ethan said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That's well put." "It's accurate." Another silence. Then quietly, as if he was saying it to the road rather than to her, "He's a fool." "He's ordinary," Abigail said. That might be worse. That evening after supper, after the boys were in bed and Mrs. Dolan had retired, Ethan came to the kitchen doorway, his usual pause, and this time he didn't come in. He stood there with his hat in his hand and said, Abigail. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She looked up. He seemed to be working toward something. She waited because she'd learned that with Ethan Walker waiting was usually rewarded. I want you to know, he said finally, that what you've done here for the ranch for the boys, it's... He stopped. Tried again. Marcus hasn't talked about his mother to anyone in almost 2 years. Not to me. Not to Mrs. Dolan. He talked to you inside a month. She was very still. I don't know what that means exactly, Ethan said, and there was something raw at the edges of his voice, carefully controlled. But I didn't want to not say it. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded once, put his hat back on, went out. She sat at the table for a while after he was gone, her hand flat on the page of the account book, not reading it. She was in considerable trouble, she thought. The sensible kind of trouble that you could see clearly and still couldn't find a way around. The weeks that followed had a quality she'd never quite experienced before, a compound quality simultaneously expanding and precarious, like a bridge still under construction that you were nonetheless living on. The ranch was thriving in ways that had begun to attract attention beyond the Hartwell ruling. A neighboring rancher named Holt, whose operation was twice the size of Ethan's, stopped by one afternoon to ask whether Ethan had changed his record-keeping system because his figures from the last quarter were the cleanest Holt had ever seen from a spread that size. Ethan told him he had some help. Holt looked at Abigail, who was at the yard table with the accounts, and pretending with middling success not to be listening. How much is she charging? Holt said. She's not consulting, Ethan said. There was something in his voice that closed the subject. Holt left. Abigail kept her eyes on her books. But later, when Ethan brought her a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, and set it on the corner of her papers, she looked up and he was already walking away, and she thought about the way he'd said, she's not consulting, the particular quality of it, the finality of it, as if the question of her leaving had been a door he'd shut firmly without quite acknowledging he was shutting it. She thought about it for longer than she should have. The second twist came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. It was Marcus, who told her on a Tuesday morning in late August that his father used to be different. They were in the garden again. They'd fallen into an easy habit of working the early morning garden together, a companionable silence broken occasionally by something one of them found worth saying. Marcus had become over the weeks a different creature than the guarded, brittle boy who'd watched her from doorways. He wasn't soft, she didn't think he ever would be, and she respected that in him. But he was honest with her in a way that she understood was rare and cost him something. He used to laugh more, Marcus said. He was working the root of a stubborn weed jaw set with concentration. Before Mama got sick, he paused. He was different. What was he like? Loud. Marcus seemed surprised by his own memory. Not mean loud, just present. Like when he came in a room, the room knew it. He pulled the weed free. After Mama died, he got quiet. And then he just stayed quiet. Abigail sat back on her heels. Do you think that's changing? Marcus looked at her sideways, with the directness of a child who has decided to be honest, because he's calculated that honesty is more useful than tact. You make him talk more. She said nothing. At supper, Marcus continued. He used to just answer if we asked him something. Now he... Another pause. He says things that aren't just answers. He studied the weed in his hand, as if it might have opinions. I heard him laugh last week, in the kitchen talking to you. I haven't heard him laugh since... He stopped. You don't have to say. Since the spring before Mama died, he said anyway. That's a long time. It was. It was a very long time. Abigail felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of two boys living in a quiet house with a father who had gone somewhere they couldn't reach. Marcus, she said. He looked at her. I don't know what happens next, she said. because he was too intelligent for comfortable fictions and too vulnerable for carelessness. I don't know what this, she gestured between herself and the general direction of the house, is or what it becomes. But I want you to know that I'm not going to be someone who makes promises she can't keep, not to you or your brother. He looked at her for a long time with those old young eyes. Then he said, "You're not like I thought you were going to be." What did you think I was going to be? Someone who tried to replace her. His voice was steady, harder than it should have had to be for a boy of 11. Everyone who's come around since she died, women and town neighbors, they all got this look, like they were measuring for furniture. I know that look, Abigail said quietly. You don't have it. No, I don't. She picked up her trowel. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm trying to be useful, and I'm trying... She stopped. I'm trying to be honest. He nodded, once. Picked up his own trowel. They went back to work. She didn't tell him that his words had hit something in her chest with the precision of a well-aimed stone. She didn't tell him that you don't have it. 4 simple words from an 11-year-old had done more for her sense of her own place in the world than anything Thomas Reed's reversal, or the Merchants Board ruling, or Cal Briggs's pointed compliment had managed. She filed it away, carefully, in the place where she kept the things that were still too fragile to look at directly. It was 3 days later that Ethan found her in the kitchen at 5 in the morning. She hadn't been able to sleep. The accounts were finished, which meant her brain had nothing practical to work on, which meant it had spent the dark hours working on things that weren't practical at all. She'd come down for coffee, and was sitting at the table staring at nothing in particular when he appeared in the doorway in his work clothes, clearly on his way to the early chores, and stopped at the sight of her. You're up early, he said. Couldn't sleep. He came in, poured himself coffee, sat down across from her, which was habit by now, but something was different about his face this morning, more open somehow, as if sleep had dissolved some of the careful management. Bad thoughts, he asked. Complicated ones, she said. He wrapped his hands around his mug, looked at her with that steady gray-green regard. Tell me, she almost deflected. It was her first instinct, the long-practiced reflex of a woman who had learned that sharing her interior life with people was more likely to make her a burden than to make her understood. But this was Ethan Walker, who listened with his full self. I keep thinking, she said slowly, that I have no idea what I'm building here, whether I'm building something or whether I'm... She stopped, started again. I came here because a man promised me a home and a life and a beginning. That didn't happen the way I'd planned. What happened instead has been... She looked at her coffee cup. Good. It's been good. Better than I'd planned for in most of the ways that matter. But I don't know what it is. And I'm not good at not knowing what things are. The silence stretched. Then Ethan said, What would you want it to be if you could choose? She looked up at him. He was watching her with the expression she'd come to associate with the moments when he was being most himself unguarded, direct the careful management set aside. I don't know how to answer that, she said, without saying something that changes things. Maybe things should change, he said. Her heart did something complicated and rapid. She kept her voice even. Ethan, I'm not saying it right, he said, and something almost frustrated crossed his face, the look of a man who has excellent instincts and inadequate words. I'm not. He set down his coffee. I'm going to say something plainly, because I've spent 3 years being careful, and I've mostly found that careful is another word for lonely. She was very still. I don't know what this is either, he said, but I know that this house is different than it was in June. I know my boys are different. I know that He stopped. I know that I sit at this table every evening because it's where you are, and I hadn't done that, sat with someone since Eleanor died. He looked at her steadily. I'm not saying that to make you feel obligated. I'm saying it because you said you were trying to be honest, and I reckon I owe you the same. Abigail heard her own pulse for a moment very clearly. I'm frightened, she said finally. I know. I was wrong before, about a man, about what he meant. I know that too. I'm not I don't want to be someone who mistakes gratitude for something else. And I don't want you to, Abigail. His voice was quiet and firm. I've been grateful to a lot of people in my life. I don't sit in the kitchen until midnight because I'm grateful. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the early morning was still dark. I'm not ready to know what this is, she said at last. All right, he said. But I don't want to not say. She stopped, gathered herself. I don't want to not say that I'm glad I came here. That I'm glad it was you who stepped forward on that street. Something moved across Ethan Walker's face that she thought she might spend a long time remembering. Not elation exactly. Something quieter and more certain than that. So am I, he said. He picked up his coffee, finished it, put on his hat and went out to the morning chores. And Abigail sat at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn quiet with her hands wrapped around a warm mug and something warm and precarious and enormous filling the space behind her ribs, and thought, I am in considerable trouble and I don't want a way out. She didn't have long to sit with that thought before the trouble found a new shape, because Thomas Reed had not been discouraged by the conversation in the market square. He had only been regrouping. And what Abigail did not know, what she would not know until the following week, when Mrs. Dolan heard it from the blacksmith's wife, who had heard it from the woman at the general store, who had heard it from Thomas Reed himself, was that Thomas had been talking, not loudly, not cruelly, but consistently, and with the quiet persistence of a man who understood that in a small town, what you say to 3 people will eventually reach 30, and what you tell 30 people will eventually become the common truth. What he was saying was this, that he'd reconsidered his initial reaction to Miss Harper, that she was clearly a capable woman, that any man who had her running his accounts and managing his household was very fortunate, and that a man in Ethan Walker's situation, a widower with 2 boys and a struggling ranch, would naturally benefit from having such a woman, and it would be natural for her to feel a corresponding sense of obligation. Not love, Thomas was implying, without ever quite saying it. Obligation, gratitude. The specific confusion of a woman with limited options who has been treated with basic decency by the one man who offered it. He wasn't calling her a fool. He was just suggesting softly, persistently, that she might not be reading the situation clearly. Abigail heard all of this on a Wednesday afternoon and stood in the middle of the kitchen for approximately 45 seconds with absolutely still hands and a very quiet mind. Then she sat down at the table, opened the account book, and worked for the rest of the afternoon with the focused intensity of a woman who is not yet ready to decide how she feels about something and is using productivity as a container for the feeling in the meantime. She did not tell Ethan, not that evening when he sat across from her at the table, not the next morning when Marcus gave her a second piece of cornbread without being asked, and she took it without comment because refusing would have made something of it. Not that night either when she lay in the clean, simple room with the east-facing window and the prairie pressing its enormous quiet against the glass, and thought about Thomas Reed's careful insinuations, and what they meant, and what she believed, and what she was afraid of, and whether those 3 things had any overlap. What she came back to every time was what Ethan had said in the pre-dawn kitchen. I don't sit in the kitchen until midnight because I'm grateful. She believed him. She believed him in the particular deep way that you believe something not because you've decided to trust it, but because something in the structure of your own knowing has already recognized it as true. But believing a thing and being safe inside it were different, and Thomas Reed's words, soft and persistent as they were, had found the exact place in her where she was most uncertain, most vulnerable, most afraid. What if she was wrong? What if she was a woman with limited options who had been treated with basic decency and had called it love? She lay in the dark with that question for a long time. And somewhere 4 miles away in town, Thomas Reed finished his evening drink and told the man next to him at the bar that he'd been thinking about calling on Miss Harper again more formally this time, that he'd made a mistake and he intended to correct it. The man next to him nodded and said that sounded reasonable. And neither of them knew. Neither of them could have known that the woman they were discussing was lying awake in the dark, not mourning her options, or miscounting her choices, but doing something much more dangerous. She was deciding what she was worth, and she wasn't finished yet. She was deciding what she was worth, and she wasn't finished yet. The answer came to her not as a revelation, but as a slow quiet, settling, the kind of clarity that arrives after a long night, not as lightning, but as dawn, incremental and undeniable. By the time the first gray light came through her east-facing window, Abigail had not resolved everything. But she had resolved one thing: she was not going to let Thomas Reed's carefully constructed insinuations live in her head rent-free while she had actual work to do. She got up, she dressed, she went downstairs and made coffee, and was halfway through the week's supply inventory when Mrs. Dolan came in and stopped at the sight of her. "You've been up a while," Mrs. Dolan said. "Couldn't sleep." Mrs. Dolan looked at her the way she sometimes did, a long, level look that didn't ask for explanation, but made clear she was available for one. Then she put on her apron and started on breakfast, and the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells that Abigail had come to understand were the sounds and smells of a home that was functioning, and she let that understanding do some of the work that the long, dark night hadn't finished. She did not tell Mrs. Dolan about Thomas Reed's talk around town. She didn't need to. Mrs. Dolan had heard it from the blacksmith's wife 2 days before Abigail had, and had spent those 2 days in a state of contained fury that she expressed, as she expressed most things, through exceptional efficiency. The bread that week was the best she'd produced since Abigail arrived. Fury apparently was excellent for the crumb structure. What Abigail didn't know, what nobody told her, was that Mrs. Dolan had also said something to Ethan. She had said it on a Tuesday evening when Abigail was in the garden and the boys were in bed and Ethan was at the kitchen table with the month's tallies. She had sat down across from him, which was not something she normally did, and she had looked at him with the directness of a woman who has known a man long enough to dispense with preamble. "Thomas Reed is going around town saying that Miss Harper is confused," she said. Ethan had gone very still. "He's saying she's a capable woman in a situation where she's dependent, and that she might be mistaking your decency for something else," Mrs. Dolan continued. "He's saying it quietly, and he's saying it to the right people, and then he's letting it do its work." Ethan put down his pencil. "When did you hear this?" "2 days ago." A pause. "I'm telling you now because I wanted to see what you'd do with it before I told you. And I've watched you for 2 days," Mrs. Dolan said, "and I can see you've been chewing on something, and I believe you already know what's being said, or some part of you does, even if nobody's told you directly." She folded her hands on the table. "You're not a fool, Ethan. Don't let that man make you act like one." Ethan looked at the table for a long time. "What do you think I should do?" he said finally. Mrs. Dolan stood up. "I think you should stop sitting at this table, hoping she'll figure out how you feel by the quality of your silence," she said, "because that woman is intelligent enough to see your silence, and kind enough to not fill it with assumptions, and eventually someone is going to fill it for her, and you will not like what they put there." She went to bed. Ethan sat at the table until Abigail came in from the garden, and he watched her come through the door with dirt on her hands, and her sleeves pushed up, and a small smear of soil along her jaw where she'd pushed her hair back. And he thought about what Mrs. Dolan had said, and about what he hadn't said, and about the particular cost of silence when silence was no longer the honest choice. But he didn't say it that night, because Abigail sat down at the table with the ease of someone who trusted the room and the evening was peaceful and quiet, and he was afraid with the particular fear of a man who has been very careful for a very long time of being the thing that disrupted it. He was going to have to stop being afraid. He hadn't figured out how yet. Thomas Reed made his move on a Friday. He rode out to the ranch. Abigail was at the yard table when she heard the horse on the track, and she looked up and recognized him at 200 yards and felt the specific tightening in her chest that she associated with things she'd rather not deal with but was going to deal with anyway. She did not go inside. She stayed where she was. He pulled up and dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who has convinced himself he's doing something generous. He tied his horse to the post. He walked toward her with his hat in his hand, which was a courtesy he'd had to learn the second time around. "Miss Harper," he said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are." she said pleasantly. "But it's nothing that won't keep. What can I do for you, Mr. Reed?" He sat down across from her without being asked, which told her something. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I said in town, when you turned down my invitation. I remember what I said. I'd like you to reconsider." He leaned forward slightly. "I know I handled things badly when you arrived. That was wrong of me. But I think if you look at your situation honestly—" "I look at my situation honestly every day," Abigail said. "It's one of my better habits." He pressed on. "You're a capable woman. You deserve more than running another man's accounts and managing another man's household. You deserve a home of your own, a real position. I have a house, Miss Harper. I have land. And I'm asking you formally, respectfully, to consider becoming my wife." The words landed between them. Abigail set down her pen. She had thought in the dark hours of the last several nights about what she would do if he came to her formally. She had rehearsed it in the practical way she rehearsed difficult things, running through the variables, checking her own responses for cracks or uncertainties that might compromise her when the moment came. The crack, she found the one she hadn't been able to close, was not about Thomas Reed at all. It was about Ethan. Because Thomas was right about one thing: she did not have a home of her own. She did not have a formal position. She was not a wife. She was a woman who managed another man's accounts and lived in another man's house. And between her and Ethan Walker, for all the pre-dawn honesty and the kitchen table evenings and the gray-green eyes that did something different than most eyes did between them, nothing had been named. Nothing had been decided. And unnamed things were by their nature uncertain. Thomas Reed was offering her certainty. The certainty was wrong and she knew it. But the pull of it, the exhausted, road-worn pull of a woman who had been uncertain for a very long time, was real. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I need time to think." Thomas blinked. He'd expected yes or no. He hadn't expected her to be considering it. "Of course," he said more carefully. "Take whatever time you need." He left 10 minutes later with more optimism than he'd arrived with. Abigail stared at her pen on the table and thought, "I should not have said that." She knew she wasn't going to say yes, but she'd said "I need time to think," which was true. In a larger sense, she did need time to think, just not about Thomas Reed, and she'd let him leave believing it was about him, and that was going to cause complications. She was still sitting there when Ethan came around the corner of the house and stopped. He had seen the horse. He had recognized it. She could tell by the way he was looking at her, careful still, reading her, with the same full attention he brought to everything. "He made a formal proposal," she said, because there was no point in not saying it. Ethan's jaw moved, once. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed time to think." A pause. "Do you—" She looked at him directly. "Not about him." Something crossed Ethan's face, not relief exactly, or not only relief. Something more complicated, more vulnerable than that. "Then, what do you need time to think about?" he said. She stood up. She faced him across the yard table, and she said the thing she'd been not saying for 6 weeks, because she was done with careful, and she was done with the particular loneliness of staying silent inside a feeling that was taking up all the room. "You," she said. "I need to think about what you want, what this is, because I'm not going to make another decision about my life based on a man's implication. I need to hear it from you plainly, or I need to understand that there is nothing to hear." Ethan Walker stood very still. And then Marcus appeared in the doorway of the house. He looked between the two of them with the quick, sharp perception of a boy who understands adult emotional temperature the way other boys understand weather. He looked at his father. He looked at Abigail. He looked at his father again. "Papa," he said. James broke the soup pot. Ethan looked at his son for a beat. "Is James hurt?" "No, sir, just the pot." "Then it can wait 5 minutes." His voice was steady. His eyes went back to Abigail. "Give me 5 minutes," he said to her. She nodded. He went inside. She heard his voice low and calm talking to James. She heard James's voice higher and apologetic. She heard the specific sound of a mess being assessed and sorted. And then Ethan came back out, And Marcus, who had been hovering in the doorway with the performed casualness of a boy, very interested and not seeming interested, disappeared back inside with suspicious efficiency. Ethan stopped in front of her. He wasn't wearing his hat. She rarely saw him without his hat outdoors. Without it, he looked younger and more exposed and more himself. "I told you that I sit at this table in the evenings because it's where you are," he said. That was true, but it was only part of the truth. She waited. "The full truth is that I haven't been alive, not properly, not in the way of a man who's actually present in his own life in 3 years." He said it with the steadiness of someone who has looked at a hard thing long enough to stop flinching at it. "I got through. I kept the ranch going. I kept the boys fed and schooled and as right as I could manage. But I wasn't here. Not all the way." He met her eyes. "You showed up in July, and inside 2 weeks I was here again. I don't know how else to say it." Abigail's chest did something complicated. "Ethan, I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "You know that by now." "I know that. So when I tell you that what's here between us in this house is not something I'd sacrifice for being careful, I need you to believe me." She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you," she said, "but—" because he could hear the but. "But I have been wrong before," she said. "Not about you. I don't think I'm wrong about you, but about my own ability to read a situation when I want something from it. I came here wanting something, Ethan. I came here desperate and hopeful, and both of those things make a person—" She stopped. "They make a person see what they want to see." "Then let me make it so there's nothing to misread," he said. He reached across the yard table and took her hand. Both of his hands around hers, calloused, warm, deliberate. "I love you," he said. "Not the accounting, and not the garden, and not what you've done for this ranch, though I'm grateful for all of it. I love the woman who sat in this kitchen at midnight and worked on a problem because she couldn't leave it unsolved. The woman who taught my son to pull weeds by the root and let him talk about his mother. The woman who stood in the street and told Thomas Reed no without a tremor in her voice." He held her gaze. "That woman. That's who I love." She was quiet for long enough that he might have been concerned if he hadn't been watching her face. He was watching her face. What he saw there was not doubt. It was something older than doubt, the laborious, hard-won process of a woman who has taught herself not to believe good things without evidence, confronting an avalanche of evidence and trying to figure out how to let it in. "I'm not easy," she said finally. "I didn't want easy. I take up space, in a room and otherwise." "Yes," he said, and the complete unconcern in his voice, the simple factual acceptance of it, hit her somewhere so precisely tender she almost looked away. "I'm going to say yes to things and no to things, and the no's aren't going to be negotiable." "Good," he said. "I don't want someone who negotiates herself away." She looked at their joined hands on the yard table. She looked at the ranch around them, the fence Marcus had started helping repair, the garden she'd brought back from neglect, the account books that had turned a struggling operation into a sound one, the house that had flowers in its front window for the first time in 3 years. She looked at Ethan Walker's face, open and steady and more afraid than he was pretending, because she could see it now, the fear underneath the certainty, the fear of a man who has lost one person and is standing on the edge of wanting another and knows exactly what it costs when it goes wrong. "I love you too," she said. The breath he let out was barely audible. She stopped, smiled slightly with the specific quality of a woman who finds something both painful and absurd. "I've been not saying it for weeks. It seemed dangerous," he said. "Yes. Still does." She looked at him. "Yes. But I'm not going to let that be the reason I don't say it." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just kept holding her hands there at the yard table with the Kansas afternoon burning around them, and something settled, something long unsettled in both of them, into a new and unfamiliar and deeply welcome shape. It might have stayed quiet. It might have been allowed to grow at its own pace, careful and unhurried, protected by the ordinary rhythm of the ranch and the days. But Thomas Reed had already set things in motion that wouldn't stop moving just because two people at a yard table had finally said what was true. He'd taken her. I need time to think back to town, and told two people, just two carefully chosen, that Miss Harper was considering his proposal. That she seemed to be weighing her options. That a woman in her situation, however capable, naturally had to think practically about her future. Those two people told 4. 4 became 10. 10 became the common understanding of Harlan Creek by Sunday morning. And the common understanding had an opinion. She first felt it on Sunday when she and Ethan and the boys went to the Sunday market, which had become a comfortable routine. 3 women she'd begun to think of as friendly: the schoolteacher, the Reverend's wife, and a sharp-eyed woman named Gertrude Hale, who ran the dry goods store, all smiled at her, with the particular smile of people who believe they know something. Gertrude Hale pulled her aside near the fabric bolts and said in the low, urgent tone of a woman delivering important intelligence, "I think it's wonderful what you're considering. Thomas Reed's farm is much more established than well. You'd be a genuine landowner's wife. You deserve that." Abigail went very still. "I'm not sure where you heard—" "Oh, everyone's heard," Gertrude said warmly. "And everyone agrees you've more than earned a proper situation. It's the sensible choice." She patted Abigail's arm. "We're all rooting for you." Abigail smiled with her face and absolutely nothing else. She found Ethan at the wagon 20 minutes later. He was talking to Cal Briggs, whose expression changed when Abigail walked up something awkward and quickly suppressed the look of a man who has heard a thing and isn't sure what to do with it in the presence of the people it's about. "I'll leave you to it," Cal said, and moved away faster than the situation strictly required. Ethan watched him go. Then he looked at Abigail. "What just happened?" he said. "Thomas Reed," she said, "has been talking." The ride home was quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. Not the warm, inhabited silence they'd built between them over weeks. This was the silence of two people sitting next to something difficult and deciding how to handle it. It was James who broke it from the back of the wagon, asking whether Abigail was going to stay with them, always with the artless directness of a 9-year-old who doesn't know the question is complicated. Ethan and Abigail both started to answer at the same moment. They stopped. "I'm staying for now," Abigail said carefully. James accepted this and went back to his whorehound candy. Marcus said nothing, but she felt him behind her listening with the full self-attention he'd inherited from his father. That evening after supper, Ethan asked her what she wanted to do about Reed. They were alone in the kitchen. The lamp was lit. It was their hour. "I'm going to tell him no," she said. Plainly and finally. "All right. But that won't stop the talk." "No," he agreed. "It won't. People are going to say—" She paused. "They're already saying that I'm a woman with no real position here. That what we—" She stopped again. "They're saying I'm confused. That I'm mistaking gratitude for something real." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Are you—" "No." "Are you sure?" She held his gaze. "I was surer before the whole town started expressing opinions about my emotional clarity. That's what gossip does. It makes you doubt things you didn't doubt before." She looked at the table. "I hate that it's working." "It's working because you're honest," he said. "If you weren't honest, you'd already be certain." She looked up at him. "The fact that you keep checking," he said, "is the reason I trust you." She sat with that. "I'm going to write him a letter," she said finally. Clear, final, documented. A small, wry pause. "It's what I do." Ethan made a sound that was almost a laugh. "And after that," he said. "After that," she said, "we let the town say what it's going to say. And we do what we do. And eventually—" She stopped. "Eventually what?" "Eventually, the evidence is going to be louder than the rumors," she said. "That's always how it works. You just have to survive the gap." He nodded. He looked at her with that open, steady regard, the fear still there underneath, and the certainty still there underneath the fear, layered and honest and real. "We'll survive it," he said. And she believed him. The letter to Thomas Reed went out Monday morning with the post. It was 3 paragraphs precise and final, and it closed every door without cruelty and without ambiguity. She had drafted it the night before, rewritten it once, and read it through twice to make sure there was nothing in it he could reinterpret or use. There wasn't. She had gotten good at that. What she had not anticipated, what neither of them had anticipated, was what Thomas Reed did when the letter arrived. He did not accept it quietly. He had made his recalibration public. He had announced in the careful, persistent way she was coming to understand was his particular method that he was pursuing Miss Harper formally. And now he had been refused formally in writing, and that refusal was going to get around just as fast as the pursuit had. Which meant Thomas Reed was going to be embarrassed. And embarrassed men in Abigail's experience were considerably more dangerous than confident ones. She found out what he'd done on Wednesday when Ethan came in from town with a face she hadn't seen on him before, controlled and cold in a way that went deeper than his usual quiet. He sat down at the table without taking off his hat, which he never did. That alone told her something. "What happened?" she said. He put a folded paper on the table in front of her. She picked it up and read it. It was a notice posted that morning at the Harlan Creek Land Office from Thomas Reed. It cited a claim documented with forged dates. She could see that immediately, but documented that a portion of the Walker Ranch's eastern water access ran through land that Reed claimed had been improperly registered. He was filing for a review of the original deed. If the claim had any traction, it would freeze the ranch's operating water rights for the duration of the review, which could be months. Which for a cattle operation was not months of inconvenience. It was potential ruin. Abigail read it twice. Her hands were steady. "How solid is your original deed?" she said. "Solid," Ethan said. "My father filed it in 1871. The records are at the county seat." "Are there any irregularities? Any gaps in the chain of filing?" A pause. "There's one transfer in 1878 when my father conveyed the eastern section to me directly. The county recorder at the time was..." Another pause. "He was not a careful man. The documentation is it may not be complete." Abigail felt the shape of the problem with the specific precision of someone who had spent years thinking in documentation. Thomas Reed had not found a genuine weakness. He had found a place where the record was thin, and he was going to press on it hard enough that the pressure itself would cause damage, even if the underlying claim was false. It was, she thought with a kind of cold clarity, actually quite a sophisticated attack. For Thomas Reed, "I need to see everything," she said. "Every land document you have. The original deed, the 1878 transfer, every survey, every tax record. I need it tonight." "Abigail, this is solvable," she said. She said it not because she was certain she wasn't certain yet, but because Ethan's face had something in it that was close to the look of a man who is beginning to believe he might lose, and she was not going to let that take root before she'd had a chance to look at the evidence. "This is the kind of thing I know how to do. Let me look at it before either of us decide how worried to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to the study. She heard him pulling boxes from the shelf. She got up, rolled up her sleeves, and went to help. They worked until 2 in the morning. Mrs. Dolan brought them coffee at 10 and looked at the paper spread across the table and said, "Is it bad?" And Ethan said, "Not sure yet." And Mrs. Dolan said, "Then I'll make more coffee," and went back to the kitchen. The 1878 transfer was indeed imperfect. The county recorder had used a non-standard form. The witness signatures were incomplete, and there was a period of 6 weeks during which, on paper, the ownership of the eastern parcel was technically ambiguous. 6 weeks was enough. But there was something else. Something Abigail found at midnight in a survey document from 1874, folded into a property tax receipt she would have missed if she hadn't been going through everything systematically the way she went through everything. She unfolded it and read it twice. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. She put the survey on the table in front of him. "The water access Thomas is contesting the eastern stream. This survey from 1874 establishes the water boundary based on a natural marker, a specific rock formation." She pointed to the notation in the surveyor's hand. "Do you know where this is?" He studied it. His face changed. "Yes, I know exactly where it is." "Is it still there?" "It's still there. I've ridden past it 100 times. Then the water boundary was established before the 1878 transfer under your father's deed, and the transfer of the eastern parcel was a conveyance of land, not of the water rights which were separately recorded." She looked at him steadily. Thomas Reed's claim is based on the assumption that the water rights were part of the 1878 transfer and therefore subject to the recording irregularity. But they weren't. They were established separately in 1874 under a deed that is solid. She paused. "He's attacking the wrong document." Ethan looked at the survey. He looked at her. "Can you prove that?" he said. "By tomorrow afternoon," she said, "I can write something that will make it plain to any land commissioner in Kansas." He sat back in his chair. Something moved through his face relief and something harder to name, something that looked like awe without the performance of it. "Abigail," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Let me finish the work." She went back to the documents, but she felt his eyes on her for a moment longer before he went back to his own work, a look she filed carefully in the place where she kept things that were still too important to look at directly. And then they worked side by side in the lamplight until the case was built clear and documented and unarguable. And the clock on the wall said 2 in the morning, and outside the Kansas night held everything in its enormous, indifferent quiet. She did not know then what Thomas Reed would do when he realized the claim had failed. She did not know how the town would respond when the story came out, and it would come out. She understood small towns well enough by now to know that. She did not know what would be required of her in the days ahead. What she knew was this: she was sitting in this house at 2 in the morning by her own choice, next to a man she had chosen, doing work that was hers to do. Nobody had put her here. Nobody was keeping her here. She was here because she had decided she was worth something, and she had found people who agreed, and she was not going to let Thomas Reed, or the town's whispers, or the long accumulated weight of everyone who had ever looked at her and decided she wasn't enough, take that from her. She was not going to let him make her small. But Thomas Reed was not finished. And what he did next, what he set in motion on Thursday morning in the county land office, with a man Abigail hadn't yet accounted for, was going to force a reckoning none of them had seen coming. A reckoning that would require Abigail to stop surviving and start fighting. Not with paperwork, with everything she had. She was not going to let him make her small. But Thomas Reed was not finished. The man Abigail hadn't accounted for was named Gerald Potts, and he was the current deputy land commissioner for the county seat at Millhaven, and he had been taking money from Thomas Reed for the better part of 2 years. She didn't know that Thursday morning when she and Ethan drove to Millhaven with the survey documents and the water rights record and the case she'd built until 2 in the morning. She knew only that the evidence was solid and the argument was clear, and in her experience, solid evidence and clear argument were sufficient. She had not yet learned that sufficient and successful were different things when the man across the table had already been paid to reach a different conclusion. Potts received them in the county office with the practiced cordiality of a bureaucrat who has learned to be pleasant while doing unpleasant things. He was a small man with careful hands and a way of listening that looked attentive, but wasn't. He took the documents Abigail laid out, read through them with what appeared to be thoroughness, and then set them down and laced his fingers together on the desk. "This is compelling," he said. "Very thorough work." "Thank you," Abigail said. "However," he picked up a separate file from his desk, and she noted that it was already there, already open, already waiting. "Mr. Reed's filing includes a deposition from the original surveyor of the eastern parcel, a Mr. Frank Aldous, who states that the 1874 water boundary marker was incorrectly recorded, and that the true boundary falls within the contested parcel." Abigail went still. "May I see the deposition?" she said. "Of course." He slid it across. She read it. Her face did not change, but her mind was moving very fast. Frank Aldous had been the county surveyor in 1874. He was, she happened to know from the survey document itself, 73 years old if he was still living. His signature on the deposition was dated 10 days ago. His hand was shaky, but legible, and the statement contradicted specifically and surgically the one piece of documentation she'd believed was incontestable. She handed it to Ethan. He read it. "This surveyor is 73 years old," Abigail said, keeping her voice even. "Has he been deposed in person, examined by a neutral party?" "The deposition was witnessed by two parties," Potts said smoothly. "Named parties." She looked at the document. "The witness signatures these are illegible, Mr. Potts. Standard practice allows. Standard practice does not allow unsigned witness attestations on a deposition that contradicts a recorded public document," Abigail said. "I'd like to know whether Mr. Aldous is available for examination." A brief pause. "He's an elderly man. He's not well." "Then I'd like to see documentation of his current condition from a physician." Another pause. Slightly longer. "I'll need to request that. Please do." She gathered her documents. Her hands were perfectly steady. "We'll await your request before this proceeding goes any further. I trust you'll agree that a deposition from an elderly witness in compromised health with unverifiable witness signatures doesn't constitute sufficient grounds to freeze an operating ranch's water access on a 40-year-old deed." Potts looked at her with the expression of a man who has underestimated someone and is revising rapidly. I'll put the freeze on hold pending verification." They walked out of the county office into the hard September light, and Ethan didn't say anything until they were at the wagon, and then he said, "He's bought." "Yes," she said. "You knew in there." "I suspected when I saw the file was already open. I was certain when the witness signatures were illegible." She climbed up. "He's bought, but he's not bold. He backed down the moment I gave him documentation language. A man who's bold about corruption doesn't back down from a woman with a survey map." Ethan got in beside her. "So what do we do?" "We find Frank Aldous before Reed does," she said. "Before anyone prepares him for a second interview." He looked at her. "He's 73 years old, and he's not well, and someone put a pen in his hand and told him what to write," she said. "I want to know whether he understood what he was signing." They found Frank Aldous in a rooming house in a town called Creed, 12 miles east of Millhaven, on a Friday afternoon. He was in fact not well. He was thin and somewhat confused, and living in two small rooms with a woman who appeared to be a paid caretaker, and who looked at Ethan and Abigail with immediate suspicion when they knocked. "We're not here to cause him any trouble," Abigail said. "We just want to ask him about a survey he did in 1874, for his own records." The caretaker, a broad, no-nonsense woman named Harriet, studied them for a long moment. Then she stepped back. Frank Aldous was sitting in a chair by the window. He had the distant, partially present quality of the very old and somewhat unwell, but his eyes, when they focused on Abigail, were clear enough. "Mr. Aldous," she said, sitting across from him at eye level. "My name is Abigail Harper. I'm not here on behalf of any legal proceeding. I just want to talk about the Walker Ranch survey of 1874. He looked at her. "Walker," he said. "John Walker's place. John Walker was Ethan Walker's father. Ethan is right here." She gestured. "He remembers the survey. There was a rock formation that marked the eastern water boundary." Something sharpened in the old man's eyes. "Saddle Rock," he said. "Called it that because it looked like—" He shaped something with his hands. "Two humps." "Yes, sir." Ethan's voice was quiet. "I know exactly where it is." "Solid marker," Aldous said. "I put it in the record because it wasn't going anywhere. Rock that size, it was going to outlast the deed and the county both." A pause. "Why are you asking me about it?" Abigail said carefully. "There's a document with your name on it that says the marker was incorrectly recorded, that the boundary falls in a different place." The old man's face went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, then something uncomfortable, then a faint but genuine distress. "Someone came," he said. "Couple weeks ago. A man. Brought papers. Said it was said I needed to confirm something about an old survey." He looked at his hands. "Harriet wasn't here. He said it was routine. I signed something, I thought it was... He stopped. I couldn't read it too well. My eyes. Abigail was very quiet. Mr. Aldous, she said. Did that man tell you the document said the 1874 boundary marker was incorrect? A long pause. He said it was a clarification, a technical correction. Did he read it to you? Another pause. Longer. No, the old man said. He did not. Ethan's hand on the back of his own chair tightened once and then released. Abigail said, Mr. Aldous, would you be willing to make a sworn statement that you were not informed of the content of the document you signed, that you believed it to be a routine clarification? He looked at her steadily. What I signed wasn't what he said it was. No, sir, it was not. Something settled in the old man's face. A kind of dignity, the specific kind that comes from a person deciding they still have some. Then yes, he said. I'll make that statement. Harriet from the doorway said, I'll witness it. They left Creed 2 hours later with a sworn and witnessed statement from Frank Aldous written in Abigail's hand and signed in his attesting that he had been misled as to the nature of the document he'd signed, that he had not been read its contents, and that his professional survey of 1874 stood as recorded. On the road back, Ethan said, You knew he'd been manipulated. I suspected, she said. An elderly man in poor health, not well enough to travel to the county seat himself with illegible witness signatures. It had the feel of something done quickly without scrutiny. She looked at the road ahead. The document was professionally written, but the execution was careless. Reed hired someone to compose it, and then took it to Aldous himself, which was a mistake. You don't use the subject as your own delivery system. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn to think like this? 32 years of people underestimating me, she said. You develop a very accurate eye for what's real and what's constructed. He looked at her sideways. Then he said, Abigail. After this is settled. He stopped. Started again. I'd like to do this properly. She looked at him. I'm not saying it right, he said, and she recognized the phrase because he'd said it before in the yard, and it meant he was navigating something that mattered more than his usual steadiness could entirely contain. I'm saying that I've been thinking since the yard, since what we said about what comes next. For us. And I don't want to keep leaving it unnamed. Ethan, she said, are you trying to propose to me while driving a wagon back from a fraud investigation? He considered this. It appears that I am. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had stepped out of a crowd on a July street and offered her plainness when she'd been given nothing but spectacle, who had sat across a table from her in the evenings and listened with his full self, who had said, I choose you exactly as you are, before she'd even asked him to, and she said, ask me again when we're not in a moving vehicle and you're not still angry about Gerald Potts. I'm not angry about Gerald Potts. Your jaw has been doing that thing for the last 4 hours. He touched his jaw, a brief involuntary pause. I'll ask you again when we're not in a moving vehicle, he said. Good, she said, and the road ran under them, and somewhere behind them in Creed, Frank Aldous's statement was drying on the page, and somewhere ahead in Harlan Creek, Thomas Reed did not yet know that the weapon he'd spent 2 weeks constructing had just been quietly and completely dismantled. He found out on Monday. Abigail sent copies of the Aldous statement, the original 1874 survey, and a formal letter of complaint regarding Gerald Potts's conduct to 3 places. Simultaneously, the County Land Commission, the State Land Office in Topeka, and the Dodge City Register, which was the regional newspaper of record. She did not ask Ethan's permission. She told him what she was doing, showed him the documents, and waited. He read them. He said, send them. She sent them. The response was not immediate. These things never were, but the fact of the complaint's existence was enough to change the shape of the proceeding. Potts, upon receiving his copy of the letter that named him specifically and cited the specific procedural violations, withdrew from the case entirely by Wednesday, citing a conflict of interest he declined to specify. The freeze on the water access, which had never formally been issued, was quietly abandoned. Thomas Reed received his copy of the Aldous statement on Tuesday afternoon, and by Tuesday evening, Cal Briggs at the feed store had heard from someone who'd been near the hotel that Thomas had been seen reading a document at the bar with an expression that was, in Cal's words to Ethan, the color of a man who's been caught in a room with the door locked from the outside. The town began to understand that something had happened. Not all of it, not at once. Small towns assemble their understanding the way they assemble their opinions incrementally through accumulated fragments, rearranging the picture as new pieces arrive. But the picture was rearranging. It was Gertrude Hale of all people who came to the ranch on Thursday morning. Abigail was in the garden. She heard the horse and looked up and recognized Gertrude by her upright posture from 50 yards. And she stayed where she was and let the woman come to her because she was done going toward people who required managing. Gertrude Hale dismounted, tied her horse, walked to the garden gate, and stood there for a moment looking at Abigail with an expression that was navigating the distance between what she'd believed 3 weeks ago and what she understood now. "Miss Harper," she said. "Mrs. Hale. I've been hearing things." A pause. "About the land claim, about what you found." Abigail said, and kept weeding because she had found that a neutral sound was more powerful than most words. "I said some things," Gertrude said, "when Thomas Reed was, when I believed—" She stopped. "I told you his proposal was the sensible choice. I said some other things around town that were in the same vein." "I know," Abigail said. "I was wrong." The simple directness of it made Abigail look up. Gertrude Hale's face was uncomfortable but undefended, the face of a woman who has made an assessment founded in error and come to say so without embroidery. "Yes, you were," Abigail said. "I assessed your situation and drew conclusions that—" Gertrude paused. "I looked at your size and your circumstances, and I made certain assumptions about what was reasonable for you to want and what was possible for you to have." The bluntness was almost startling. Abigail sat back on her heels. "That's an honest accounting," she said. "I'm a honest woman," Gertrude said. "I'm not always a fair one. There's a difference, and I know the difference, and I should have—" She stopped again. "I should have looked at what you actually were before I started deciding what your options actually were." A beat. "What am I, Mrs. Hale?" Abigail asked. "Not with acid. Genuinely." Gertrude looked at her for a long moment. "The woman who kept Ethan Walker's ranch from being stolen from him," she said. "Among other things." Abigail looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "Would you like some coffee? Mrs. Dolan made a fresh pot this morning." Gertrude blinked. Yes, thank you." They sat at the yard table, and Abigail did not pretend the prior conversation had not happened, and Gertrude did not pretend she had not said what she'd said, and there was between them, by the end of an hour, the beginning of something honest. It was not the last such conversation. The Reverend's wife came on Friday. Cal Briggs said something to Ethan at the feed store that amounted to a public correction of his prior stance delivered with the efficiency of a man who wants the record straight. The school teacher, whose name was Clara Voss, and who had always been the friendliest of the three, stopped Abigail on the street on Saturday and said simply and directly, "I'm sorry I listened to him." And Abigail said, "It was well constructed. You weren't the only one." And that was that. Thomas Reed, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Not gone. He was still in Harlan Creek, still at the hotel, still visible around town, but the particular quality of his presence had changed. He was no longer moving through the community with the expansive energy of a man managing his reputation. He was smaller now, in the specific way of men whose constructions have been publicly dismantled. People who had been his audience were no longer performing that role. Ethan watched this from the particular vantage point of a man who has seen trouble coming and had it handled before it could fully land, and the gratitude he felt was entangled with something more complicated. The specific vulnerability of a man who has needed saving and has been saved by the person he loves and is trying to locate that in something other than humiliation. He found it finally on a Saturday evening. He found it because Marcus found it first. Marcus came to the kitchen where Abigail was doing the accounts and Ethan was having his coffee, and he stood in the doorway, his old doorway posture, which he'd largely abandoned, but sometimes returned to for important statements, and said, "Is Miss Harper going to be my stepmother?" The kitchen went very quiet. Abigail's pen stopped. Ethan set down his coffee with a precision that suggested he was using the action to buy himself a moment. "That's," he said, "a conversation for adults, Marcus." "I'm nearly 12, Marcus said. "And I'm asking because James asked me to ask because he didn't want to ask himself, and I'm asking because I want to know too." He looked at Abigail. "Do you want to be—" She looked at this boy, this sharp, fierce, protective boy who had taught her how to pull weeds and told her about his mother and straightened up beside her in the market square like an escort. And she said, "I want to be in this house, with your father, and with you, and with James, whatever that's called." Marcus processed this with his usual thoroughness. "Papa," he said. Ethan looked at his son. "Stop doing the jaw thing and just ask her," Marcus said, and went to bed. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "He's not wrong," he said. "No," she agreed. He stood up. He did not make a production of it. He did not go down on one knee with any kind of ceremony because he was not a ceremonial man, and she did not want ceremony from him. She wanted him exactly as he was. He stood across the table from her, and he said plainly, "I would like you to be my wife. Not because of the accounts or the garden or the Hartwell ruling or the fact that you just saved my ranch from a man who tried to steal it. Because of who you are, and because this house is yours as much as it's mine, and because I want to stop pretending any of it is temporary." She looked at him. "I asked Marcus and James," he said, "earlier this week, before today." That stopped her. "You asked them?" "It's their house too," he said simply. She felt something move through her chest with the force of something long held finally released. "What did they say?" Marcus said it was about time. Something shifted in his face. James cried, happy crying. He explained the distinction. She laughed. It came out unexpected and full and real, the laugh she'd been surprised by in the kitchen that first month, the one Ethan had overheard and quietly converted into a cough. This time he didn't convert anything. He just watched her with everything he felt right there in his face, unmanaged and unhidden. "Yes," she said. "Ethan, yes." He reached across the table and took her hand. And that was all. No speeches, no production, just his hands around hers, and the lamplight between them, and the quiet house around them, and everything that had been building since a July street in Harlan Creek, finally settling into the shape it had always been moving toward. They sat there for a while without talking, because they were both of them people who understood that some moments were better witnessed than narrated. What Abigail did not know in that kitchen in that moment was that Thomas Reed had spent the week making a different kind of calculation. Not legal this time. Not the careful, documented, bureaucratic kind of attack he'd tried before. He had lost that ground completely, and he knew it. Gerald Potts was no longer available to him. The Alda statement had closed the legal avenue. What he had left was the social kind. And what he had concluded in the specific narrow logic of a man who has confused being bested with being wronged was that if he could not have what he wanted, and could not damage what he'd attacked, he could at least make enough noise that the victory would feel incomplete. He started on Sunday. He was at the church social, which was a monthly event that most of the community attended, and he waited until there was a natural gathering of people, Ethan and Abigail among them, because they had come together for the first time as something that the town was beginning to understand was a couple, and he walked into the center of it and said loud enough for the group to hear, "Miss Harper, I'd like a word." Ethan moved to stand beside her. Thomas looked at him, then at her. "I think this community deserves to understand what's been done here," he said. "I filed a legitimate legal inquiry into a disputed boundary, and I've been subjected to this woman has conducted a campaign to destroy my reputation. I filed an accurate account of what I found," Abigail said. Her voice was even. "You filed a complaint with the state office because a deputy commissioner accepted money to mishandle a proceeding," she said. "If that's not a matter for the state office, I'd be interested to know what is." People were listening. This was a church social, which meant virtually the entire county was present, and they were all listening. And Thomas Reed had chosen this venue deliberately because he believed that public pressure was still something he could work with. He had misjudged his audience. "You came here as nobody," he said, and there was something ugly underneath it now, the layer that the careful language had been covering. "You came here as a woman I turned away, and you've spent 4 months turning a man's sympathy into what?" Abigail said. A pause. "Go ahead," she said. "Finish it. You chose a public venue. So did I the first time when you finished your sentence in front of 40 people and walked away. I didn't have a choice about that audience. You've chosen this one. Finish your sentence." Thomas Reed looked around the crowd. He saw Gertrude Hale with her arms folded and her face set. He saw Cal Briggs watching with the expression of a man who has already made his assessment. He saw the Reverend's wife and Clara Voss and a dozen ranchers and their families who knew Ethan Walker and had heard over the past 2 weeks the story of Gerald Potts and Frank Aldous, and a woman who'd stayed up until 2 in the morning to save a ranch from a fraudulent claim. He saw Marcus standing at Ethan's other side with his arms folded in an exact mirror of his father's posture. He did not finish his sentence. "Mr. Reed," Abigail said. Her voice was not unkind. It was something colder and more complete than unkind. "I came here with a bag and $43 and more hope than was probably warranted. You made a decision about me based on what you saw in the first 30 seconds, and you announced it loudly enough for the whole street to hear." She paused. "I don't blame you for the decision. I blame you for using what happened afterward, what I built, what this family built as material for the kind of legal maneuvering that put an elderly man's signature on a document he wasn't read." She looked at him steadily. "That's what I filed a complaint about. Not your opinion of me, your conduct." The crowd was absolutely quiet. Thomas Reed was quiet for a long moment, and then he said with the stiff, reluctant quality of a man who has run out of room, "I may have handled certain things poorly." It was not an apology. It was a retreat. But in the specific economy of a small town where a retreat in public is its own form of record, it was enough. Ethan beside her said nothing. His jaw was doing the thing, but his eyes were on her, and what was in them was not anger and not pride, but something that looked very much like home. Marcus at his father's side unfolded his arms. And Harlan Creek, which had watched one thing be built and another thing fall, and a woman be dismissed, and then be reckoned with, began the slow collective work of revising what it understood and who it was willing to see clearly. It would not happen all at once. It never did. But it was happening. And Abigail Harper, who had arrived on a Tuesday in July with a blue traveling dress she'd sewn herself, and $43, and a heart full of stubborn hope, stood at the center of it. Not small, not uncertain, not waiting for someone to tell her what she was worth, and felt for the first time in a very long time exactly the right size. Thomas Reed left Harlan Creek on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the church social. Nobody made a production of it. There was no scene, no final confrontation, no dramatic departure with witnesses arranged. He simply settled his hotel bill, loaded his wagon, and rode out before most of the town was awake. Cal Briggs mentioned it at the feed store. Gertrude Hale noted it to the Reverend's wife. By noon, it was known, and by supper, it was no longer interesting because Harlan Creek had newer things to think about. Abigail heard it from Mrs. Dolan, who delivered the information with the brisk satisfaction of a woman disposing of something that had been taking up unnecessary space. "Good riddance," Mrs. Dolan said, and went back to her bread. Abigail sat with it for a moment, not with grief or triumph, but with the particular quiet of a woman who has been fighting something for long enough that its absence takes a beat to register. Then she went back to the supply inventory she'd been working on because the ranch didn't stop requiring attention because a man had finally understood he'd lost. But something had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a story that announces its own turning point. It changed the way genuine things change slowly from the inside out until one morning you look up and realize the weight you've been carrying is gone and you can't identify exactly when it left. The weight that left Abigail in the weeks following Thomas Reed's departure was the weight of contingency. The sense that her place here was provisional, that the ground beneath her feet required constant maintenance to stay solid, that she was always one revision away from being returned to the street in July with her bag and her $43 and nowhere to go. That weight left. And what was underneath it, what had been growing underneath it for months without her fully seeing it, was something so steady and so rooted that she stood in her kitchen on a Thursday morning in early October and felt it like the floor itself. Solid. Hers. Real. Her kitchen. She noticed herself thinking it and didn't correct it. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of November because Ethan had asked and she had said yes, and Mrs. Dolan had immediately begun making logistical assessments with the focused energy of a woman who has been waiting for something to plan. The date was practical. The cattle were quieted in November, the weather was still manageable, and it gave enough time to do the thing properly without giving enough time for anyone to overthink it. Abigail had not expected to feel much about the wedding itself. She had spent so little of her life imagining it as a real possibility that the planning of it felt in the early days slightly surreal, like being handed an object she'd heard described but never held. It was Clara Voss, the schoolteacher, who changed that. She came to the ranch on a Tuesday with a length of ivory wool she'd ordered from Dodge City, and she put it on the yard table and said, without preamble, "I want to help you make your dress if you'll let me." Abigail looked at the fabric. It was beautiful, not extravagant. Clara was a schoolteacher, and not a wealthy one, but chosen with care, the kind of care that communicates itself through the quality of the selection. "You don't have to do that," Abigail said. "I know I don't," Clara said. "That's why I want to." She sat down across from Abigail with her sewing box, and the two of them began talking about the dress, and then about other things, and somewhere in the middle of it, Abigail understood that what was happening was not just the making of a garment, but the beginning of a friendship, the real kind built on honest accounting of where things had started and where they were now. "I should have said something sooner," Clara said at one point, her eyes on her measuring. "When Thomas Reed was talking and people were listening, I knew some of it felt off, but it was easier to listen than to question." "It usually is," Abigail said. "That's not an excuse." "No, but it's true." Clara looked up. "You're remarkably reasonable about people who didn't behave well." Abigail considered that. "I've spent a long time being the person people weren't reasonable about," she said. "It doesn't make me want to do it back. It mostly makes me tired." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "How did you do it? Come here after everything and stay." "I didn't have anywhere else to go," Abigail said plainly. "At first. And then I had a reason to stay that had nothing to do with having nowhere else." She looked at the ivory wool between them. "That's a different thing entirely." Clara nodded slowly. "It is?" she said. "I think that's the bravest thing I've ever heard stated plainly." The dress took 3 weeks. Abigail worked on it in the evenings after the accounts were done, and the house was quiet, and sometimes Clara came, and they worked together, and sometimes Mrs. Dolan sat nearby and offered opinions she delivered as facts, which was her manner, and which Abigail had long since stopped finding anything other than comfortable. Marcus, who had made his position on sentimentality very clear over the years, came to the doorway of the kitchen one evening while she was sewing, and stood there for a moment and said, "Is that your wedding dress?" "It is," she said. He studied it. "It looks like you," he said, which from Marcus was the highest possible form of aesthetic endorsement, and then he went to bed. She sat smiling at her needle for a full minute after he left. James's contribution to the wedding preparations was more direct. He informed Abigail on a Sunday afternoon, with the serious air of someone presenting a formal proposal, that he had been practicing a speech. "A speech," she said, "for the wedding, to say about you." He had a piece of paper folded 4 times, which he opened with great care. "I wrote it. Would you like to practice it on me?" He thought about this. "No," he said finally. "It might make you cry, and then I'd feel bad. "I might cry anyway," she said. "At the wedding. It doesn't mean I feel bad." He considered this distinction seriously. "All right," he said, "but I'm still not telling you what it says." She respected the boundary. Ethan, in the weeks leading up to the wedding, was himself in the particular way of a man who has made a decision that is exactly right and is navigating the unfamiliar territory of being exactly happy. He was not prone to displays which she knew, and she did not need them. But he found her every evening wherever she was, and sat near her. And there was in that consistent, unhurried finding a quality of intention that meant more to her than any speech could have. One evening he came in from the late chores, and she was at the kitchen table, and he stopped behind her and put his hand on her shoulder. Just his hand, steady and warm, and didn't say anything, and she put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment, before he went to wash up, and it was, she thought, about as close to perfect as a moment could get. But the ranch did not stop being a ranch because its inhabitants were happy. The first week of November brought a problem with the northern fence, a section that had been on Ethan's repair list since August, and had finally given way under the weight of 3 large steers who objected to its authority. 2 of the cattle were easily recovered. The third had gotten through onto the Henderson property, which bordered the Walker land to the north, and Jim Henderson, who was a fair man but a precise one, came to the door on a Monday morning to let Ethan know. Ethan went to deal with it, taking Marcus with him because Marcus was old enough to help and needed to learn how these things were handled between neighbors. That left Abigail and James and Mrs. Dolan and the ordinary morning work of the house, and it should have been a quiet Monday. It wasn't because of what arrived in the post. Abigail was at the yard table when the delivery boy from town came up the track and handed her an envelope and rode away, and she looked at the return address and felt her chest do something complicated. It was from the state land office in Topeka. She opened it carefully. It was not about the Walker Ranch. That matter had been closed. Gerald Potts quietly removed from his position, the fraudulent deposition nullified. She knew that. This was something different. The letter informed her that her formal complaint, in conjunction with 2 other complaints from ranchers in the county who had experienced similar land access interference, had triggered a broader investigation into Gerald Potts's conduct over the preceding 3 years. The investigation had found a pattern. Potts had been taking payment from a single source, Thomas Reed, to selectively delay, misdirect, and in 2 cases, fraudulently advance land claims in the county. The state was pursuing formal charges. At the bottom of the letter, a paragraph she read twice. The state land commissioner wished to commend the thorough and precise documentation provided by Miss A. Harper of Harlan Creek, which had supplied the foundational evidence for the broader investigation. Without that documentation, the pattern would have remained obscured. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she went inside and told Mrs. Dolan, who read it, and said, "Well," with an intonation that contained an entire speech's worth of meaning, and put the kettle on. When Ethan came back from the Henderson place with a recovered steer and a 12-year-old boy who had apparently negotiated the return with a maturity that had impressed Jim Henderson considerably, Abigail handed him the letter at the door. He read it standing in the yard, still in his dusty coat. He looked up. 3 ranchers, he said. "At least," she said. "The investigation is ongoing." He looked at the letter again, then at her. "You started this," he said, "with the Hartwell invoices in July." "I started it with the Hartwell invoices," she agreed. "Thomas Reed finished it by overreaching." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Something in his face was doing the complicated interior work she'd learned to recognize the processing of a thing that was larger than it had appeared when it started. "How many ranches did he damage?" he said. "I don't know yet. The letter doesn't specify all of them, but the pattern goes back 3 years, which means—" She stopped. "Which means he was doing this before you arrived," Ethan said, "and might have continued if he hadn't decided to use the same method on someone who knew what she was looking at." He looked at her for a long moment, not with awe which would have made her uncomfortable, with something quieter and more intimate, the look of a man who knows someone well enough to understand the full dimension of what they've done. "Marcus," Ethan said, turning to his son who was standing nearby with the alertness of a boy who has learned that listening is useful. Yes, sir. What do you know about due diligence? Marcus blinked. It's what Abigail does with the accounts, checking everything twice. It's what saved this ranch, Ethan said simply. Remember that. Marcus looked at Abigail. Something moved across his face that he controlled quickly with the instinct for self-containment he'd been developing since he was 8 years old. Then he said, "Yes, sir," and took the steer to the barn. The letter from Topeka was not the last consequence of what Abigail had set in motion. Over the following 2 weeks, 2 of the other affected ranchers came to the Walker place individually to speak with her. Not with Ethan with her. They were both men in their 40s, weathered and practical, and they came with their hats in their hands and a directness she appreciated. The first one, a man named Pete Carver, said, "I spent 6 months thinking I'd made a mistake in my own deed. Couldn't sleep. My wife thought I was losing my mind." He looked at her steadily. "Turns out I hadn't made any mistake at all. Someone had just paid a man to make me think I had." "I know," she said. "Your complaint is what opened it up." "Your deed records are what proved it," she said. "I just asked the right questions." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Ma'am, I don't know what Ethan Walker is paying you." "She's not being paid," Ethan said from the doorway where he was not pretending not to listen. "She's marrying me." Pete Carver looked between them. Something that might have been a smile moved briefly across his face. "Then he's getting the better end of that deal." He said, put his hat back on and left. The second rancher, a quieter man named Samuel Holt. No relation to the other. Holt didn't say much. He sat at the yard table and drank his coffee and looked at the account documentation she showed him, which confirmed that his own records had been correctly filed and the interference had been entirely on Potts's end. Then he said, "My daughter's 13. She wants to be a lawyer." He paused. "I'm going to tell her about this." Abigail looked at him. "I'm going to tell her that a woman figured out a fraud that 3 men missed," he said, "and then documented it well enough to take down a crooked commissioner and a corrupt land speculator, and she did it on a stranger's ranch with borrowed lamplight." He picked up his hat. "I think my daughter should know that's possible." He rode away. Abigail sat at the yard table for a long moment with her coffee going cold. Then James appeared at the kitchen door and said, "Abigail, Mrs. Dolan says it's your turn to check the bread." And the moment was over, and the day continued, and she was grateful for both things equally. The Saturday of the wedding came cold and clear, the way November mornings come in Kansas. The sky a hard bright blue, and the air carrying the first real edge of winter, honest and clean. The ceremony was at the church small by choice. Abigail had not wanted a performance. She had wanted witnesses, and what she got was the 40 or so people who constituted the community she'd been building: Clara and Gertrude and Cal Briggs and Pete Carver and Samuel Holt and Jim Henderson and his wife and the Reverend and his wife and a scattering of ranching families who had over the months moved from observers to participants in the world of the Walker Ranch. Mrs. Dolan sat in the front row and cried from the moment the ceremony started, which she would have denied if pressed, and which everyone present chose to ignore out of respect. Marcus walked Abigail in, which had been his idea offered so briefly and with such studied casualness that she'd almost missed it as a genuine offer and not a rhetorical one. She hadn't missed it. She'd said yes before he could revise the offer, and she'd felt his arm stiffen slightly with the weight of the moment, and then steady the same. Steadying she'd watched him do in the market square, in the garden, in the kitchen doorway. This boy who had been carrying things too heavy for his age and had not put them down yet, but was learning slowly that he didn't have to carry them alone. James gave his speech. It was 4 sentences. The first one said that he had been scared when his father said a woman was coming to live with them. The second said that he had changed his mind after the checkers game. The third said that she had taught him to read the stars and to lose gracefully, and that those were the most useful things anyone had ever taught him. The fourth said that he was glad she had come on the stagecoach, because if she hadn't, his father would probably have kept doing the jaw thing indefinitely, and it was very distracting. The church laughed. Ethan made a sound that was specific and involuntary. Abigail kept her face composed for approximately 4 seconds and then gave up on composure entirely, and the tears she'd been holding since she walked down the aisle came out warm and uncomplicated and real. Ethan took her hand during the vows with the same deliberate, unhurried certainty with which he did everything. No performance, no drama. Just the full weight of his attention directed at her and the words they were saying. And she felt under his gaze exactly as she had described to Clara Voss. Not provisional, not contingent. Not a woman whose worth was under negotiation. Chosen. Exactly as she was. The Reverend pronounced them, and Ethan kissed her with the careful intentionality of a man doing something he's been planning to do properly. And the 40 people in the church made the sounds of 40 people who have been waiting for something to be resolved, and are relieved to see it finally fully resolved. What came after was both smaller and larger than the ceremony. It was the supper at the ranch where Mrs. Dolan had somehow produced enough food for 60 people, while claiming she'd only planned for 40, and where Pete Carver turned out to play a fiddle with genuine ability, and where Marcus danced exactly once with Abigail, with the rigid dignity of a boy performing an obligation he had also secretly wanted, and James danced with everyone who would have him, which was everyone. It was the moment late in the evening when the guests had thinned and the boys had finally reluctantly gone to bed, and Ethan found her at the yard table with a cup of coffee she was using as an excuse to have 5 minutes of quiet, and he sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, and looked at the dark prairie, and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You all right?" "Very," she said. "It's a lot of people." It was exactly the right number of people. He turned to look at her. "Are you happy?" She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, because she was a woman who did not use words carelessly. And happy was a word that had meant different things to her at different times in her life. A placeholder for hope when she was young, an accusation. When she was struggling, a concept she'd half convinced herself was theoretical. "Yes," she said. "I'm happy." He took her hand on the table between them, the same table where she'd laid out the Hartwell invoices 4 months ago, where Ethan had told her about the feed costs, where Marcus had eaten his cornbread, where the letter from Topeka had arrived, and held it the way he'd been holding it since the ceremony. Like it belonged there. "Me too," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. He didn't move. They sat like that under the November stars, while the last of their guests said their goodbyes inside, and Mrs. Dolan's voice organized the cleanup with her usual authority, and the Walker Ranch settled around them in the particular way of a place that has found its right shape. The months that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real is ever without difficulty. Winter came hard that year, and took 2 of the younger cattle and strained the feed supply into a calculation Abigail revised 3 times before she found a solution that worked. Marcus broke his arm in January falling from the fence he'd been specifically told not to climb, and spent 6 weeks in a sling, being aggressively stoic about it, which was worse for everyone than ordinary complaining would have been. A dispute with the county over road access to the eastern pasture required 2 months of correspondence before it was resolved in the ranch's favor, because Abigail had learned to start the correspondence from a position of complete documentation. And Thomas Reed, from wherever he had gone, and nobody in Harlan Creek was entirely sure where that was formally charged in February with conspiracy to commit land fraud in conjunction with Gerald Potts. The trial was in Millhaven. Abigail did not attend. She submitted her documentation and her deposition by written record, because she had learned that some things did not require her physical presence to be true and effective, and because she had a ranch to run and a husband to sit beside in the evenings, and 2 boys who needed breakfast before school. The conviction came in March. She heard about it from Ethan, who heard about it from Cal Briggs, who had ridden out specifically to deliver the news because he understood its weight. 14 months, Cal said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hand. Reed and Potts both. Ethan looked at Abigail. She looked at the account book in her hands, and then out at the eastern pasture where the Saddle Rock boundary marker stood exactly where Frank Aldous had recorded it in 1874, solid and unchanged and going nowhere. "All right," she said. Cal blinked. "That's all?" "What else should it be?" she said. Cal opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Ethan, who had the expression of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by his wife and has settled into a state of continuous appreciation. "I suppose that's all," Cal said, and put his hat back on and rode back to town. Spring arrived the way it always did in Kansas, without asking permission. Sudden and enormous, the prairie going green almost overnight, and the cattle moving differently in the new air. Marcus turned 12 in April and demanded as his birthday wish to take on formal responsibility for the eastern fence maintenance, which Ethan granted with the gravity the request deserved. James found an injured crow in the north field and brought it home and named it Arthur and spent 3 weeks nursing it with an attentiveness that Abigail recognized as inherited from a father who had once stepped out of a crowd to help a stranger. Arthur recovered. He stayed around the yard for another month, eyeing everyone with crow intelligence, and then left one morning without ceremony. James was philosophical about it in the way he was philosophical about most things, which was to say that he felt it fully and then moved on. "Things stay as long as they're supposed to," he told Abigail, watching the sky where Arthur had been. She looked at this 9-year-old boy who had cried happy crying at his father's engagement and given a 4-sentence speech that had undone a church full of people. "That's true," she said. "You're supposed to stay forever," he said. "So you will." She put her arm around his shoulders. He leaned into it with the easy warmth of a child who has relearned slowly that leaning is safe. By summer, the Walker Ranch had become something the county noticed. Not because of drama or legal proceedings, that chapter had closed cleanly, but because of the simple accumulated evidence of a well-run operation. The accounts sound the cattle healthy, the land properly documented, and defended the household functioning with the warm efficiency of people who genuinely want to be where they are. Other women began coming to Abigail. Not formally, not with any organized purpose, but the way women find each other in small communities when one of them has demonstrated something useful. A rancher's wife with a billing dispute. A widow with a deed question. A young woman from the Henderson place who wanted to understand how to read a land survey and was embarrassed to admit she didn't know. Abigail taught her, clearly and without condescension, at the yard table with the original 1874 survey as an example. The young woman came back the following week with a friend. She did not charge anyone. That wasn't the point. The point, the thing she understood sitting at that table with women who were smart and capable, and had been told in various ways that their intelligence was peripheral rather than essential. The point was that knowledge shared is not knowledge diminished. Her father had taught her that. She was teaching it forward. Ethan watched this from the doorway he had always used, still pausing there, still doing that thing of deciding whether to enter, and one afternoon watching a small group of women leave the yard table with papers. They understood better than they had arrived. He said from the doorway, "You know what you've built here?" She looked up. "I know what we've built." He shook his head slightly, not disagreeing locating. "This part," he said, "yours." She looked at the yard table, at the gate through which Gertrude Hale had walked with discomfort and honesty, at the track up which Pete Carver and Samuel Holt had ridden with their hats in their hands, at the survey map still rolled in the leather cylinder she kept on the shelf inside, which had done more work than most weapons and made less noise about it. "I came here with $43, she said. "I know. And a letter from a man who looked at me and decided I wasn't worth keeping." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think the whole trip was worth it." He crossed the yard and sat beside her, not across beside, and she leaned her shoulder into his, and he let her weight settle against him, and that was all. Nothing more was needed. The ranch was quiet around them, and the Kansas sky was doing what it did, that great indifferent expansive blue that went on past seeing, and underneath it, two people who had found each other on a Tuesday in July, and had been honest enough, and brave enough, and stubborn enough not to let it go. A woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much, too large, too stubborn, too independent, too particular about her own worth, had walked into this county with nothing, and had rebuilt it piece by piece, document by document, conversation by conversation, into something that was entirely and unapologetically hers. She had not needed to become smaller to be loved. She had not needed to quiet herself or soften her edges or negotiate away the parts of her that took up space. She had not needed to become someone else's idea of what a woman should be in order to be exactly what one man and two boys and an entire community needed her to be. The man who had rejected her saw a body and walked away. The man who loved her saw everything else and stepped forward. And in the end, in all the ways that mattered in the account books and the garden and the yard table and the pre-dawn kitchen and the November church and the eastern fence and the Saddle Rock boundary marker standing exactly where it had always stood. Abigail Harper Walker was exactly where she belonged, exactly as she was, and that was not luck, and it was not accident, and it was not someone else's gift to her. It was hers. She had built it. She had earned it. She had chosen it and been chosen back, and that made all the difference in the world.